So when I met Katharina, I was fascinated by the research. I was really Goldsmiths and bakers. You haven't graduated to do the bakers one. You're just going to do the Goldsmiths one. I said, really, Goldsmiths in Lagos? How many? She told me, how many? I said, no, in the city. And she said, yes, that she done the research. The research, I'm just coming from a position of, I guess. But the more I talked to her about it and the more I listened, I was fascinated. So I said, okay, this is something that whether anybody likes it or not, I'm interested in it. I sold it to Lamont. He became interested in it. We actually went on a little tour to meet with Katharina on research. And when we decided to do it as a talk, I've actually been amazed at the amount of interest. So I thank you all for confirming that our hunch was right. And I'd like to thank Katharina for being with us today. Okay, we are 5:10, so anybody who is late is late. So, so a round of applause for all of you for coming on time. And a round of applause for the people online also being on time. A round of applause for them too. Can I ask you online, just to show by a show of hands, is the volume good for you? Can you hear? Because I think the volume is okay for us here, right? For you online, is it clear? Can you just indicate in the chat? Just a show of hands, yes, no. Then so that we know whether Katharina should use the mic or not.
It's not so much the volume, it's the quality of the sound. It's intermittent.
Okay.
Okay, that could be network, maybe.
That could be network, Vincent. Hello, Vincent. A round of applause for Vincent for at least speaking up. That's okay. Okay.
Yeah, does this change the quality of the audio?
Yes, it does. Very much so.
Yes, it's better?
Very much so. Very much so.
Okay.
Vast improvement. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. Can you see us? We look a bit dark. But okay, and here we have our last guest, just on time. So round of applause to them for just having made it just as we're about to believe it. Hello, everybody. So, do you want to switch off those lights? And then, because we look a bit dark here on the screen. Yeah, but on the screen, we look dark. I don't know. Maybe on. No, on. Anyway, welcome everybody to, and formally, to More Than Platters of Gold, a presentation on a study by Dr. Katharina Oke on the Goldsmiths in Lagos around 1940 to 1980. Katharina is a postdoctoral researcher currently conducting a research project in partnership between the University of Graz in Austria and the University of Ibadan in Nigeria. She has studied journalism and African studies in Vienna and obtained her PhD in history from the University of Oxford. Round of applause, round of applause. Katharina has worked on newspapers and print culture for her PhD and has now turned to the study of goldsmiths and bakers. You can tell from her name that Katharina is a Nigerian, however, she grew up in Austria. So a round of applause. Welcome her back. So over to you, Katharina.
Thank you so much for the introduction, for everything, for all the introductions, and also thank you, Mr. Adams, for hosting us here tonight. Thank you very much. What I would like to do tonight is to give you an insight in what is very much an ongoing research project. So I want to share with you some thoughts, some of the things I had the fortune to learn, and yeah, especially to learn in conversations with goldsmiths, but also in the archives. And yeah, again, this is not, although sometimes in the archive feels like a solo venture, but in this case, I want to give special thanks again to Loving Lagos, to Auntie Aduke, to Mr. Adams, and also to Yomi Sueno, who took us to see Goldsmiths the other day, and many others who are maybe coming a little bit later. It was a lot of wonderful people that made conversations possible and helped me along the way. And yeah. So as Auntie Aduke said, my research is on the history of Lagos by focusing on bakers and goldsmiths. So what I'm interested in is what it means to make things in Lagos, be that bread or jewelry. So I'm more generally interested in the role of artisanal labor or crafts, what kind of role they played in the history of Lagos, and what it meant to do these jobs. After all, I'm a historian, so the past. So you could say the project is interested in the history of productive work, small industries, maybe even entrepreneurship. It can be described as urban history. It touches on the history of science and technology, perhaps. It can be described as socio-cultural history, or as an economic history. Although I'm not so, not the... Yeah.
Not good on the economics?
No, not so. Okay. Still learning a lot. So again, goldsmiths are just one part of the larger project, and it might actually seem a bit odd to bring together goldsmiths and bakers. But for me, the idea was to look at different modes of making things, at different things people make, to say perhaps something a bit more general about what it means to make things in Lagos. And yeah, what actually brings these two professions together is, if we think about it, both work with heat in the bakery, and the goldsmiths with fire in order to melt gold. And for me, this is also shown by machinery, which is actually crucial to both professions. So here we see on the right-hand side the dough break that bakers use. On the left-hand side, we see the rolling mill goldsmiths use. So for me, there's a certain similarity in the machinery and like sort of the way in which these machines prepare crucial material for further preparation for both professions. So I thought that was actually an interesting coincidence, if we put it that way. So again, what I want to do is to share my current thinking, very much still ongoing the research. Still me very much posing questions, having questions. So I will start with my thoughts on the background of the goldsmith profession in Lagos, then turn to how goldsmiths, how goldsmiths and more broadly crafts and artisanal work was viewed in society, before I go into some of the ups and downs of the goldsmith business over time, starting from the 1940s and taking us up to about 1980. So that's the rough plan. Okay, so again, my current thinking. So the way I see the modern, quote unquote, modern profession of goldsmith emerging in Lagos around the turn of the century, at the turn of the 20th century, is the coming together of various factors or various strands in a way. So first of all, there's of course the long tradition of bronze casting in Benin, but also in Egypt. Work which included the fabrication of intricate jewelry, as we can see here, for these two bronze bracelets from the 18th century from Egypt. And this connection somewhat becomes more tangible when we hear that one goldsmith in his late 60s today told me about his grandfather, that he was coming to Lagos from Egypt, presumably sometime after 1850. And yeah, other goldsmiths also told me that there were many Ijebus amongst them when they were learning. And another goldsmith, when I asked him about the origins of the profession in Lagos, he told me it is women from Egypt who really like to wear a lot of jewelry. So this link to Egypt I found very strong. Secondly, there's of course the influence of the so-called Afro-Brazilians. That is the Afro-Brazilians returning to Lagos and other parts of Nigeria from the middle of the 19th century and bringing with them goldsmithing skill. I think so-called.
Okay.
Sorry. Afro-Brazilian. But if we think about Afro-Brazilians, we think more of architecture and architectural design, but also goldsmith craft is something that comes with the Afro-Brazilians to Lagos. Some sources also suggest that it was in particular Afro-Brazilian women who were influencing Lagos fashion with their taste and love for fine clothes and expensive jewelry. Yeah, and that's sort of contributing to the emergence of the goldsmith profession in Lagos. And this ties in well with the history of the so-called signares, further west on the coast towards Senegal. From the 16th century, powerful, wealthy women traders, the so-called signares, were employing their own goldsmiths. So here, that's what I was thinking to put the slide. So this is women patrons employing goldsmiths. So here we see the Rao pectoral. That's from the 14th century. That was, or is located to what is nowadays Saint Louis in Senegal. So if we think about the signares and their taste for gold, this is very much sort of, well, this is how I imagine their taste of jewelry was what he was speaking to, in a sense.
But it's quite contemporary, this design. I mean, you would wear it, right? I mean, who here, be honest, you can, there's envy, right?
Yeah. So another factor, another strand. If we think about connections in West Africa, and if we talk about gold, I think our first thoughts go actually to Ghana, perhaps. Yeah. So, I mean, these connections, I'm sure, have existed for a very long time, with regards to the to trading gold, but also in terms of sharing skills when it comes to goldsmithing. In the archive, actually, I could only find a couple of traces that take this connection to the 1940s. So these are 3 applications, just examples of goldsmiths applying to have their licenses transferred from Accra to Lagos in the 1940s. And I think this speaks to something I will come back to how well the goldsmith business was running in the 1940s, or in the late 1940s in Lagos. And if we look at the letter to the very right, the name we see is Akintoye Ogbodo. So again, preliminary thinking, but when I read his name, I thought, did this person actually go to Ghana to learn the skill and then come back in 1940? So the archival traces take us to 1949, but then I also looked at a couple of newspapers so we could take this connection in a sense a bit further back. Yeah, in a Ghanaian newspaper, I came across this goldsmith, A.F. Upa, and I mean, it's an advertisement for his own business. So of course, he would claim he's established.
Okay, and he has it down the side.
Yeah, very nice, right? Yeah. But I mean, you see also the newspaper and the picture, so you have to be creative in the sense of how you play with text. But so let's assume Alfred Hooper was a well-known and much patronized goldsmith in 1940 Cape Coast. In the 1920s, we see his name appearing in Yaba. By that time, he was apparently known as Pa Hooper, the goldsmith of Yaba. So he donated land to Catholics in Yaba, on which they established St. Patrick's. And St. Patrick's today is known as St. Dominic's. And it's this Catholic church close to Yaba Tech. Yeah. So, I mean, and then another trait to bring Alfred Cooper to Lagos is that this list from 1955, where we see his name amongst 4 gold traders in Lagos. His business seemingly continued after independence. So in 1983, I found sort of a hint that A.F. Cooper and Sons Limited was still located in Lagos, and sort of you could find them in the registry of business. So again, the link to Ghana, way longer in existence, but this is how I could sort of flesh it out a little bit so far. And again, the archives are never a comprehensive account and a very biased account, but from what I've seen in the archives, one of the first goldsmiths mentioned by first name, or the one I could take back the furthest, is Elijah G. Omobehi, who said he was a goldsmith since 1970. And of course, he must have learned from someone. This is again just an indication.
1917.
1970. Okay. Yes. What I want to turn to now is moving a bit away from trying to think about origins, let's put it that way, and turn to what I've titled Goldsmith Society and Politics. I, of course, find Goldsmith work fascinating. But as part of my research, I also wanted to look at the ways in which goldsmith work and artisanal labor more generally was seen in society. So in the conversations I was able to have with goldsmiths both in Ghana and in Nigeria, the sense I got is that, in particular for goldsmiths who have been in the profession for a long time, their impression is that the heydays are over, that the best time for goldsmiths was in the 1970s, the time of the oil boom. They say there's no gold today, and that because of the economy and also because of security issues, people don't want to buy gold anymore. And this sort of ties in more with the society and politics part I'm interested in. Goldsmiths say that rather buying from them, people prefer to buy machine-produced jewelry, and sort of in the latest fashion is to buy jewelry from Saudi Arabia. And then there's various complaints about if these pieces get broken, it's impossible to repair them because they're hollow and things like that. But what these experienced goldsmiths also tell me is that to them, the younger ones and those setting out to become goldsmiths, trying to do apprenticeships, they have no patience, that they want to make money quickly, that they don't have the patience to learn the profession properly, or abandon it altogether when, after a short time, or when they realize the high level of sophistication that is necessary to craft the pieces they envision. So again, this further encouraged me to look into how artisanal labor and crafts were seen in society more generally. And I think we'll see that certain discussions or certain arguments about artisanal labor have been going on for quite some time now. The way it looks to me is that when it comes to appreciating artisanal labor, we see a change with colonial rule. So in 1937, reflecting back on pre-colonial times, Aderemi, the owner of Ife, highlights how arts and crafts were the most popular industry in Ife, and how this industry was attracting men of noble birth. If we look at Benin and the rich crafting tradition there, specific items were only made for Yoruba, especially brass casting and ivory casting, or ivory carving, which again speaks to the high regard in which these products were held. And here too, it was royalty that was involved in craft production. Ubaiweka was, for instance, an ivory carver and a blacksmith. But then contemporaries observed that since the late 19th century, it's become harder to make a living it's been harder to make a living for artisans. And in the colonial context, we see a change in the focus of what is being highly valued by and in the aspirations of young people. We see how it becomes more attractive for young people to strive for, quote unquote, Western education in order to gain clerkly employment or secure a job as part of the colonial administration. These were professional routes which were associated with the hope of materializing a higher social status. and power in this newly configured society. But Western education was not easily accessible, it was fought for, it was highly political, and also colonial administrators tried to restrict it around the 1920s, and this was something people rightly protested against. So we see on the one hand side, for instance, Obafemi Awolowo in his autobiography sort of recalling that in the 1920s, to appear literary and well-educated was fashionable among the young people. And at the same time, we also see from the 1920s how in newspapers the discussion changes a little bit. So in the Yoruba newspapers, or the emerging Yoruba newspapers, these newspapers turned to everyday Lagosians. They were starting to use Yoruba, and they portrayed artisanal skills, skilled manual labor as sort of protagonists in the mission for progress and as the backbone of national cohesion and thus also the political future. But I would argue that this was sort of a minority discourse. And what you're looking at already, which I put up a bit too early, is a quote by Nnamdi Azikiwe from 1937 in Renaissance Africa. And I put it on there because for me it sort of shows how he valued both quote-unquote literary education and skilled manual labor or artisanal skill. Sort of this second part of the quote: behold one way out of this economic maelstrom, let the graduates of the school embark upon the ocean of the world, forgetting the false values with which were fastened on their mentality during their school days, namely that an educated person is destined to be a clerk all his life. And this is something that is repeated in Azikiwe's newspaper. This is, for instance, also when he specifically addresses women, he refers to quote-unquote traditional industriousness women, sort of most likely referring to women traders, but also referring to artisanal work by, for instance, mentioning girls' shoes. This is very much something that he also saw the importance. Yeah, and speaking of Azikiwe, I want to briefly turn to politics and the fight for independence. The title of the talk speaks of more than platters of gold, right? And this is actually a reference to this saying that independence was handed to Nigeria on a platter of gold. So what I was thinking is, if we think about the fight for independence, we might think of teachers, we might think of railway workers, if we think about important milestones towards independence. The general strike of 1945, these were very much groups that were involved, and we might not think of Goldsmiths in the first instance. So I came across two events where Goldsmiths inscribed themselves into, which were important. So the first one is from the 1920s and 1930s. One of the big controversies was the so-called Ileko question, the question of the recognition of Eshubai Ileko as the Oba, or the king of Lagos. And to cut the story short, Eshubai Ileko was resisted the colonial administration, was expelled from Lagos. There was demonstration, protests, petitions, the Privy Council in the UK was involved. And in 1931, the colonial administration decided to drop the matter and recognized the Oba. And this was a great victory. Demonstrations in Lagos, well-wishers, dances, records were being released and so on. And Goldsmiths contributed to the festivities too. And this is sort of a short advertisement of a goldsmith saying that he's ready to prepare gold coins, rings, earrings with the sort of with the, how do you say, the face or the picture, the image of the Oba or Heaven Macaulay was also crucial in this political episode, inscribed on rings or earrings for sale. So yeah, it's like literally marking this occasion and sort of inscribing themselves into the festivities and creating these momenti for people to take with them. And I mentioned the general strike briefly, which is like, yeah, milestone. If you're thinking about the fight for independence, and 1945, exactly. And I think a month before, the NCNC, so Nnamdi Azikiwe and Herbert Macaulay's party, they were demonstrating against the Richard Constitution. So they were collecting money to send a delegation to London. And in an article, they then portrayed or they emphasized the contribution of the goldsmiths, donating 25 guineas as first installation towards this crucial protest in the heart of the empire. Yeah, in this context, to me, this shows that it's the goldsmiths and their support that is giving the NCNC legitimacy in a sense. It speaks to a broader support for this delegation. And also, what it also implies for me is that goldsmiths were clearly community leaders in that sense. Otherwise, we wouldn't have seen that sort of emphasis as well. So I wanted to connect the goldsmiths with politics as well. But now I want to turn to what I termed gold, money, and ups and downs of the goldsmith business. As I said, some goldsmiths today say that it can be quite hard to acquire gold, and this was also complained in the 20th century, especially up to the 1940s. It seems to be, gold seems to have been quite scarce in Lagos. And what also was on top of this is that the colonial administration sought to control the flow of gold, or the traffic of gold, as they called it, because they wanted to control the income that could be made with raw gold. And they were concerned about the effect that gold could have on other aspects of the economy. It's about, as I said, not so much economic history, but like the idea of the value of currencies. That is very crucial, especially in the international market, sort of the gold backing the pound sterling. So initially, major centers of gold mining were in the north, Sokoto, Katsina, Kano, and Zaria. And mining was done by big expatriate companies. So it was actually fairly easy for the colonial administration to control the flow of gold and limit circulation of gold within Nigeria in that context as well. Because these companies too were mainly interested in the export of gold. But then after the 1940s, access to gold seems to have become easier. And it was around this time that it became clear that there was gold in Western Nigeria, in the Ilesha-Ife region. And it was found close to the surface, and thus it was relatively easy to mine. And this led many people to join mining activity in the hope of making a quick fortune. And yeah, by 1945, it was clear that this was the biggest sort of deposit of gold in Nigeria. And colonial administrators panicked, were very concerned about illegal small-scale mining activities, and illegal in that sense meant it was beyond the control of the colonial administration. And yeah, people didn't have the proper licenses and didn't pay royalties. Therefore, it was deeply illegal. Yeah, according to the colonial administration, and here for now I lean heavily on the colonial archive, the sale of the gold that was mined in this region was then, in an organized fashion, brought to Lagos. And yeah, in theory, one would think it would make it easier for goldsmiths to actually access gold now. And that it might even perhaps be cheaper. But it seems gold was more complex than that, because if there was gold in official channels, it was at times still cheaper than the locally mined gold. So gold, in a sense, was still scarce because goldsmiths paid even more for the locally mined gold at times. So gold is a bit complex, but I would think it became a bit easier to access gold from the 1940s. But as I say, what we mainly see is colonial panic about goldsmiths and the traffic of gold. So from 1944, 1945, a goldsmiths ordinance, which had been in existence before, was enacted. And that meant that goldsmiths had to register with the colonial administration and undergo inspection. They had to demonstrate their skills, they had to have their workshops inspected by the police to see how their books were kept, that they kept a record of the gold they had, and that they were using the correct weights. And what we can learn from sort of the large amount of documents that was produced in this context is an indication of how many goldsmiths were operating in Lagos at this time. And I compiled some of these. Yeah. So we see that between 1945 and 1957, there were about 400 and 500 goldsmiths allowed to operate in Lagos. We know that in 1948, 90% of all goldsmiths in Nigeria were registered in the Western region, from which we might conclude that there was a great demand for gold products among the Yoruba. Lagos had the second highest concentration of goldsmiths in the whole country. And we also know, and this is like, I think, the third line, for 1947, that there were 1,500 applications for goldsmiths licenses. And to me, these are very impressive numbers, especially if you keep in mind that by 1950, 1952, Lagos had 230 to 260,000 inhabitants. So,
maybe you want to say those numbers again?
So 500 goldsmiths for 200 and 230 to 250,000 people. It's a lot of goldsmiths, no? That's of course. And but as I said, colonial panic around goldsmiths, they always each year try to reduce the number of people who would be granted a license. For some, it was even 20 goldsmiths would have been enough for Lagos, which is then a very stark difference. So I took a closer look at the numbers, and apologies, I'm not a graphic designer, so the map is quite ugly. But what I try to illustrate is the distribution of those goldsmiths. And you see Tinubu Square, it's in the middle, so we get an idea of where in Lagos Island we approximately covered. And so for 1949, I took the effort and filtered out those goldsmiths that were on Lagos Island, and it was 300 to 330, which is then again quite a huge number. And I highlighted on this map streets that had 3 goldsmiths or more. So I think we can see this high concentration of goldsmiths in the so-called Brazilian quarter, right? From numbers 31 to 30.
That we're biased.
Wow. And I mean, that mentions, that speaks to the Afro-Brazilian link I mentioned. And the fact that we also see a high number of goldsmiths on the island also speaks, I think, to the clientele, right? Where the people buying, members of the elite. Also true. But also, in terms of location, everything. It's close to them.
Yes, but I think that what Obade is saying is that because the city has changed so much, we forget that that was where the elite were living at the time.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. So I also looked at then how many goldsmiths were there in Yaba. Especially I was thinking about Pahupa. Was he the only one that was in Yaba in the 1920s? What happened to this area? And in the 1950s, there were 38 goldsmiths in Yabutemeta, which is sort of then the extension of Lagos, if you think about it that way, right? Exactly. Yeah, but it was only 12 goldsmiths in Yaba. And I think now the picture is quite different. And I will come back to that, sort of how Lagos has changed in the 80s and 90s. I mean, that's this sort of one goldsmith I spoke to, he actually spoke about, so his father came to Lagos in the 1950s to learn the trade, to Bamboshe Street. So he continued the father's business, but in the 80s, 90s, he relocated, and one of the things he said, it's too expensive. So he relocated to Yaba. So that's, at the latest for me. I need to do further research, but that's for me sort of the latest when the location really changed. So for me, this large number of goldsmiths speaks to the availability of gold. I said it's a bit more complex, but I think it really speaks to the availability of gold, to customer demand. And it also speaks to the fact that it must have been attractive to learn the profession. 1,500 applications in 1 year, right? And if we look at the broader economic context, we know that the world price for cocoa was increasing at that time, 1940s, 1950s. There was money to be made with cocoa. So this made this professional trajectory also possible in the first place. One goldsmith, the one I mentioned from Ondo, coming to Lagos to learn. His father was a cocoa farmer, but he had the money to send his son to Lagos to learn a trade, which meant like a paid for apprenticeship, 3 to 6 years. So this is something people could afford in the 1940s and 50s. And yeah, I was then also wondering still, what were all these goldsmiths doing? How did they keep busy in the 1940s? This is a lot of goldsmiths. And again, in a sort of protest against the Goldsmith Ordinance, we see a little bit of what they were doing, or at least what they were claiming to do. Just so we get a little bit of a feel. These are images in the 1950s and 60s.
And they're your aunties. Be honest, we know ourselves, yeah.
So on the left, we see, for instance, one of the two women wearing a pendant. It's a bit.
The people here, you know who I'm speaking to. Confess. No, we don't. Your mother and your aunties, you had this.
Yeah, the pendant. But also, if we think back, as you said, the design of the round pectoral is contemporary with footwear. Yeah, what else? Going to as well.
The second picture, I love her damask as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
Got a big back there. Damask.
The picture I showed earlier, also the intricate details of the jewelry.
Yeah. And you know, and the lady with the damask. Yeah, so those bracelets, I want to talk about those bracelets. Looking at them, in my memory, they tended to be like filigree. They were very, so even though they're wide, yes, you can, they're not filigree. Because I can remember aunties, you confess that it's coming back. Yes, aunties and they'll clasp that, like hooks that went through. Yes. Yeah.
No, wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
So no, but if I may take us back to thinking about what these goldsmiths were doing. So in newspapers, we see their main job is repairs and alterations of jewelry. But I'm also thinking that emphasizing this side of the goldsmith work in the context of the colonial state trying to control the flow of gold might also be a strategy, in a sense. So emphasizing we're not gold smugglers, we're only dealing with small quantities of gold. And it's unjust if the colonial administration is denying us licenses. So, I mean, another perspective, of course, is that since the colonial administration really sought to control the flow of gold, maybe there was not that much gold after all. So, yeah. And what we also see, competition seems to have been, so they were busy, the goldsmiths, but competition times seems also to have been fierce because we also see some applications of goldsmiths saying, there's no more business. It's too much, and applying again for having their licenses transferred, sort of going to other smaller towns, hoping that they have a future there. But for me, this, especially looking at these images, 1940s and 50s clearly was a heyday for goldsmiths. And in this context, the 1970s, which I mentioned at the beginning that the goldsmiths were referring to, seems more like a second heyday for goldsmiths. Brought one more set of images for the later periods. So the left image is from the 1970s and the right image is from the 1980s. They're not from Lagos, they're actually from Ibadan, but I felt they still speak to the period. and give us an insight. 1970s, of course, time of the oil boom and oil money. Salary increases of salaries of civil servants. Again, yeah, the Goldsmiths, we were talking to, were reminiscing that they had access to buckets of gold, that people were having big pieces of jewelry made, and I think the left image speaks to that a little bit. The pendant is quite big, right? Goldsmiths say they could buy 2 to 3 houses, that they were living a good life. Some of them
with many wives.
Yes, exactly. I was coming to that.
That's not forever.
Goldsmith saying, yeah, wealthy people, it's like known as womanizers, which might be seen as speaking to their incomes, but it might also be seen as speaking to the important roles women had for this profession. How, as I mentioned before, the main clients of Goldsmiths were actually women, that were the patrons that sustained the goldsmith business. And also how it was it was jewelry or gold jewelry that was a way for them to acquire wealth and especially to store the wealth. So thinking about it a bit more in this way, I think it's also interesting to think about gold traders and how this profession changed and how the relationship between goldsmiths and gold traders changed. In the 1950s, we see comparatively few gold traders, official gold traders again, or official, registered by the colonial administration, let's put it that way. As far as I can tell, back then, out of the 4 gold traders, 3 were goldsmiths themselves. But later on, it seems to change a little bit. I see an application by a former civil servant who was a moneylender at the time of the application, who wanted to get involved into the gold trading business. But also, yeah, my current thinking is, latest from the 1970s, we see a change in the way in which gold found its way to goldsmiths. Speaking with various people, I've learned that in the 1970s, women traveled, for instance, to Lebanon to buy gold jewelry, would bring it back to Nigeria, have it reworked, and presumably also sold this gold to goldsmiths, which again speaks to the fact that the role of the gold trader was changing and assuming a different importance, and that women were central to this, and thus to the goldsmith profession in various ways. People I talked to also recollect that in the 1980s, women were selling on the streets or announcing on the streets that they were buying gold, especially Pupa, apparently. And women were also selling gold in offices and other commercial establishments. Women had, of course, been selling gold and jewelry before, but here again, the colonial archive is misleading. So in the 1950s, we only have 3 registered gold hawkers in Lagos, which doesn't make any sense, especially with 100 goldsmiths. But the 1970s not only brought changes with regards to gold trading for women. I have looked at studies from more rural areas to get a different perspective. And in one study from Western Oyo, one author shows that in the 1970s, women, 1970s, as I said before, again, oil money, people could send their children to learn a trade. They could afford to send their people to learn a trade. In the 1970s, we see women being trained as goldsmiths, or at least, or let's put it that way, we see records of women being trained as goldsmiths. And one goldsmith we talked to, he told us when he was establishing his business in the late 1970s, he had 23 apprentices, and out of the 23 apprentices, 19 were women. So, with regards to, we might call it a shift. I'm not sure if I would call it a shift, but like I have more information on this on Ghana, and in Ghana, the literature suggests that from the 1960s, it was with the establishment of university education that made it easier for women to enter the profession. And in 1964, we have Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, and that's when we see more women goldsmiths, at least officially. Yeah, but there was nothing similar in Lagos, so the story is a bit more difficult to tease out. Yeah. I mean, I said I would try to take us up to the 1970s. The oil boom came to end in the 1970s. And it also seems that, yeah, these artisanal professional trajectories maybe became less or became harder to embark on, especially, yeah, after 1985 when economic opportunities dwindled even further. It was only some who could sustain urban-based crafts. And it changed. The emphasis was more on repairs and maintenance than using new items. It's more of a replacing and perhaps repairing and replacing and making something new. And yeah, this is also what the Goldsmith told us about these female apprentices from Accra, that once they finished their apprenticeship in Lagos, they established their businesses, but then came the downturn of the economy. They went into other businesses, but many of them also returned to Accra and perhaps could continue the goldsmith business there as long as there was demand for it. And yeah, I mentioned it at the beginning, but also what further contributed to a relative decline in the 1980s seems to be questions of security. In terms of wearing jewelry, but also in terms of buying and selling gold and keeping gold. And yeah, one goldsmith also mentioned the issue of fake gold becoming way more prevalent. Buying and selling of stolen items. And I think that's where I'd like to sort of end that. The goldsmith business seems to have become harder since the 1980s. But at the same time, there are many people very active in advocating for this profession nowadays and keeping traditions alive. And also people very passionate about passing on the skills. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Katharina. Better than that. So I'm sure we have lots of questions, but I'm just going to throw out one or two. Can we, to be on Zoom, I'm going to ask you to sit here first so that you can be on the hot seat, so that people on Zoom can appreciate you. It's not me they need to see. Is that better? I think that's better. Yeah. When the conversation first began on this, I didn't realize what a female-led industry was. Was that a surprise to you? I mean, obviously the consumers would be, but in terms of the patrons,
Yeah.
in terms of the people actually doing the work, was that a surprise to you?
I brought the seniors, I think, from the start, and that was part of my approach to the goldsmith profession. But I was really surprised hearing about 23 apprentices and 19 of them being women. That really I did not expect. So I would say I'm surprised that, like, sort of from what I've seen so far. So on the one hand, I had conversations with people, but like sort of the starting point for the project was the archive. So what I've seen in the archive, you don't see women in the archive.
You don't see women in the archive. Do you think that's a colonial thing? Do you think that, okay, so with the registration, was it full names? Would some of those names perhaps be unisex and wouldn't be together?
Yeah, no, that's true.
You know,
it's my reading, yeah.
Because it is not male and female, you might know. So you might see Oluyemi, and you might assume, I mean, do you think that you have, that you have that those assumptions are there? I'm just asking.
I think so. Yeah, no, I think so.
So I'm not going to questions. Anybody? One, I'd like to them in three. 1, 2, 3. Okay. number one. Would you like to come up and use the mic? Would you prefer? Yes, so that people online can hear you.
Hi, Kathy. Such an interesting, really interesting presentation. And I know we've had some conversations, but I am thinking about the fact that it's the Yoruba people who are mostly the consumers or patrons of the goldsmith trade. And I was just wondering, you know, within the wider context of Nigeria, if there was anything that's kind of linked to culture or sort of way of life that would, you know, sort of make it Yoruba thing.
Yeah. That is a question I don't feel equipped at all to answer, to be honest. That actually surprised me as well. Like when I read that 90% of registered Goldsmith, I mean, it was one moment in time. Was in Western Nigeria, I didn't expect that. I really did not expect that. But then sort of thinking about, I don't know, flamboyant, celebrating, it sort of started perhaps for me to come together, but like I didn't feel confident to really comment on it. It was way more surprising than I. Sorry, I'm not really giving this answer, but maybe someone else wants to comment on it.
Okay. Yeah, so okay. Can I ask you to answer the question along with your question so that we'll stay with?
No, I want to ask our question.
Okay. But you have to come here, please, to use the mic.
Hello, I'm Katharina Oke from the Goldsmiths,
Round of applause. Yeah.
Entity Nigeria, then and still now, is in the southwest. There are so many gemstones carried away from Nigeria to the north to Italy. I just came back from Italy last month for an exhibition. And surprisingly, I found so many gemstones from Nigeria and so many gold. I have friends that are goldsmiths in Italy, in Beirut, and they tell me about these things coming in, no records of it in Nigeria at all. Sad. Once you open a jewelry shop or business in Lagos, they come after you. I had a jewelry factory in Lagos many years ago, and I used to give the customs their part of my pay every month. It's very rotten.
Yeah.
Tibet. We were in Balogun Street and Than Street, better. We had a factory there, and my late father bought this company from a Lebanese, and he developed the company, and I was trained as a goldsmith and also as a gemologist, and I schooled in the United States and in Italy, and it's the too much corruption in the system does not allow this business to strive. It's a generational business. When you go to Italy, you find families from one generation to another, Tiffany, Bulgari, from one generation to another generation, but not like that in Lagos. I went to Yaba Tech to recruit. I found some students very good in artwork, but I couldn't take them on because they want the quick money and they don't have the virtues needed for this profession.
Wow. And the company was established when, sir?
1949.
Wow.
One of the gold traders I mentioned, one of the gold traders.
Thank you very much. I think yes.
I think I have two questions. So the first question is, when did you come up with the idea to make this research? Like, what is the initial experience you had? And the second one would be,
what is your aspiration for how this research is going to look like? I mean, asking as an artist who already sees a lot of visuals in his works and would love to see. I mean, I'm also a theorist, so I also love books, but I think I can also see a lot of other forms that this research could take, and I would like to know if you thought in that direction.
Okay, thank you. And question number 3 is Olakunle and then Kojo. Can you come up? Because we need to give the mic and then I'll let her answer. So after Olakunle, Kojo, then you can answer.
So I'm curious about the time frame of your research, 1940 to 1980. Is it the time that you're interested in for whatever reason, or is it when the practice sort of came into prominence? Why was it that people started the Goldsmith practice in Lagos? Because there's this thing with Benin Bronze casting where they claim that they sort of developed the lost works method and claim that the Portuguese who thought that came about 2 centuries after they had started casting bronze in Benin. But I think a lot of the ancient Benin artifacts give away another truth to that story, because they contain depictions of Portuguese soldiers and iconographies. So I think some of these things are time-based and they come with some kind of external influence. So probably the British colonial administration has something to do with it. And when they left, probably it lasted 20 more years after 1960, and then it eventually died off. It's almost impossible to find a Goldsmith in Lagos right now, but there's still sort of other traditions that have held for 1,000 years in Nigeria and Lagos, and they're not going anywhere.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for this excellent story. I have learned so much. I'm sure others have as well. Just a couple of questions that struck me as you were speaking. First is, the chart you showed where there was so much concentration of Goldsmiths around that time. Is there a sense, or did you get a sense of, did you learn anything as to whether that concentration of industry, that's a concentration of industry, right? So do you get a sense of whether that concentration of industry existed to serve just Lagos and its environs? Or was this a center of goldsmithing, that was, serving as almost like a center of excellence and expertise? So did you get a sense of it? That's one. And secondly, and maybe you can speak to this, maybe perhaps so that everybody can give insight on this as well. Are there global trends at play here that we can? So in other words, has there been globally a decline in artisanal goldsmithing, or are there peculiarities or shortcomings that we have here that sort of occasion that decline, whereas perhaps it's thrived in other markets?
Thank you. Nadine, and then we'll allow her to answer.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's really, really interesting. I'm interested in gold as a metal and material in comparison to others. Is it like, I don't know, I'm thinking about bronze, silver, other kind of materials. Like, how is it in relation to others, and maybe connected also to Yoruba culture? Is gold connected to, I don't know, specific parts of Yoruba culture maybe in comparison to other materials, other metals maybe? I'm interested in that. Yeah. And thinking about gold also not only as a material for jewelry but also a currency. Like, how is it connected? Are the gold like what you wear as a jewelry, is it also used maybe for other purposes to kind of have like some kind of, I don't know, people have gold at home because it's like a value. Is it connected to the jewelry as well? More than being jewelry, also being a value or something?
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, I can start.
Yes, start.
Trying to organize my questions. Thank you, Belinda, for the question about how I came about the Goldsmith, how I came about to start this research. And I think it also ties in the answer of the question that it's sort of time specific what I'm looking at. So my starting point is newspapers. And I found, so the research project spans the 1920s to the 1980s. So looking at print culture, I noticed that lots of newspapers became, in the 1920s, engaged what some would describe as economic nationalism. There was like cooperatives were being formed, African banks were being set up, and people started printing businesses to diversify their business. So that, in a sense, intrigued me. Thinking about the newspaper business is, yeah, I'm reading very much, I'm thinking more in terms of newspaper literature. But the newspapers, if we not just see them as newspapers, but as actually running businesses, they were one of the few businesses that were, in a sense, allowed under colonial rule to thrive. So that is my starting point. So that's why I started to, or decided also to start in the 1920s. I mentioned at the beginning sort of a little bit entrepreneurship, a little bit small industry. So it's actually thinking in terms of economic history, thinking in terms of economic nationalism, but not going into the direction of economic thought, but sort of being more interested in, yeah. When it came to the newspapers, at some point I turned to the machine turners, to the typists, to the typesetters in a sense, and that's sort of how my interest in productive work or in making things actually started. And then you have to write a project proposal. So you go and you try to find somehow you can make this happen. And then I came across Goldsmiths in the archives. And that's sort of how it came together. And then thinking about bakers, gold is something, and I think that speaks to your question as well, like in a sense, it's something you keep, something you pass on from generation to generation, like the storing of wealth. If sort of economic sources dry up, you would take the gold to the goldsmith and change it, or sell the gold in a sense. So, and the bread is different in a sense because you eat it every day. So that's sort of the idea when it comes together and thinking about making things and thinking about different, yeah, making different things in there. That was a long one. In terms of aspirations of how I would like the work to look like, or what sort of is puzzling my mind is thinking about how you learn, the literature would then call it crafts, how you learn crafts, how it's not just I asked one goldsmith and he sort of told me it's not like you follow step by step how you learn it and then make the product in a sense. It's more like watching, it's trying, it's copying. So in a sense, I'm trying to find a language for that, how I can talk about this. So I haven't gone more in the direction of visual representations, but for me it was more like sound. That is something I've started to think about at the very beginning. As you can see from the map, like my graphic design is not very good, so maybe no, it serves the purpose exactly. But like that's something. How do you talk about something that is passed on in a non-verbal kind of way? And especially historians, they don't necessarily use video in a sense, like even sound. So that's sort of what's puzzling my head at the moment. I'm thinking about sound. Yeah. I like sound. That's our question. The question about the time-basedness of the Goldsmiths. Yeah, do you think I sort of answered why it's the 1920s, right? And then sort of thinking, I was putting on my economic history hat. Sort of then the 1980s in that context are again a period where you think in these kinds of terms of small businesses, entrepreneurship, and it's very much also a discourse you have today, right? Like sort of small businesses, small enterprises, as a way to start the context. Then the question about Goldsmiths, whether it was just the high concentration, whether it was just for Lagos, or whether I have an indication if that was sort of a center for beyond Lagos. I would again sort of say I'm not 100% qualified to comment on that. I can only go back to the number that's 5. And as I mentioned, Oyo province had more goldsmiths in 1949 than Lagos, but Lagos was second. So I think it's where the gold is actually being mined. Ibadan, I haven't really looked into Ibadan, but I think Ibadan would definitely be something to look at. But again, I don't really feel qualified. And in terms of global trends when it comes to crafts, that's something I'm trying to cast the scope broader, but I'm not there yet. Very much ongoing work. I went a little bit in almost this one.
Okay, okay, yeah, because you have another question of this. Yeah.
Okay. Gold in comparison to other materials, I was very much struggling because if I think about adorning the body and Yoruba culture, I actually think of beads and not so much of gold in the first instance. So that relationship in a sense. So I also talked to someone working with old coral beads in a sense. And you see like golden elements in sort of the contemporary work he's doing with beads as well. So the materials do come together. But at times it's sort of you find references to beads, but like you wouldn't necessarily find references to gold. But then maybe it's a Lagos and sort of this idea of storing wealth in terms of currency, but like I see way more for women and the importance of women having drawers of jewelry, which are not just where parties, but it's really a way to store wealth instead of investing in antique practices.
Thank you. Then an online question. While you think about that, I got a WhatsApp comment from somebody, and she says, that was lovely. It was funny to hear Katharina talking about people like Cooper, etc., up until the 80s. I remember going to visit his daughter or granddaughter at that beautiful colonial compound. Her daughter or niece, I remember, was French speaking. Importantly, that filigree bracelet, I have the necklace, my grandmother's, sitting on my dresser. Thank you, Katharina, for an insightful look into our past. And then you can see the necklace. Can you? That's it. You have that already. Yeah. We know those who have it. Yes. So, can you answer Tayo's question online? And then there's another question at the back.
First one, thank you very much.
Yeah, so there are two actually. So take the first one.
The first one. The female apprentices, I can so I can straight answer. The female apprentices, that was later. That was in the 1970s, towards the late 1970s. So I was not aware of the editorial, but I would like to read it and also read it in context.
I can ask her to
Yeah.
send it to you.
Because when it comes to pay their share of the tax, we need to think about it.
Okay, can everybody read the question at the back, or I should read it out? Okay, I can read it. Okay, so the question is, could the fact that there was a high number of female apprentices have informed an editorial by the Daily Service in the 1950s, I think 52 or so, which castigated women for investing in trinkets but refusing to pay their share of tax? What's Catherine's view on this, and whether she's aware of the editorial? I mean, I'm not a historian, but I think that the various stories about women and tax and people refusing to pay but the colonial authorities obviously being frustrated. You are buying gold.
Yeah.
I think that's fascinating. So, Tayo, thank you for that. And let me pass you back to Katharina to answer you as historian to historian.
The historian would try to make a move in the sense I tried before, that I would need to think about it further. But I'm thinking in a very similar direction, sort of 1940s women and their taxes, sort of protest against women being taxed, and sort of all the anxieties that come with this idea of women being taxed. I'm afraid I don't really have an answer, but I'd really love to read the editorial.
Okay, so I will introduce you both offline. We have a question from Leah. Thank you for the presentation, Kathy. 2 quick questions. Did the Judeo-Christian symbolization of marriage through the wedding ring impact the expansion of the goldsmith trade in the period of your study? Are there variations in terms of the percentage of local production and foreign importation of refined gold then and now?
Thank you, Leah, for your question. I mean, I will try to answer the first question like this. We've seen sort of also the emphasis on pendants, and we talked about the bracelet. So I'm not sure if the wedding ring in itself, and was it just wedding rings? I even showed one slide in terms of other rings. So I wouldn't be sure if we can tie it down to the wedding ring alone, but it comes, of course, with a very latent things. But I haven't thought about it that way. And in terms of your second questions, the variations in items of percentages of local production and foreign importation of refined gold, I wouldn't be able to comment on that. I haven't seen numbers on this. Again, like what I can comment on is the fact that raw gold was exported, and then banks would sell, so it was exported and then banks would sell imported gold in Nigeria. And so the distribution of raw gold within Nigeria was hugely restricted. So, but in terms of percentages and sort of the details, I wouldn't be able to comment.
We have a question at the back. Yes, please come forward.
Okay, so thank you, Katharina. I guess I have a few questions, which is so which is the fact that there seems to be a tension between the informal economy and the formal economy in terms of goldsmithing and also in terms of gold trade. And I ask that because while it appears that goldsmithing seems to have kind of declined, I think we can all appreciate that gold trading still continues to a large extent in Nigeria. So it would be interesting to see what your comments are on that and what you found on that. And the second question, which ties into what she was asking, was really about the analysis and the representation of which different designs of gold that you found. Because I live in Ibadan, my grandma is from this is all from her, a lot of gold. And it's just a sense of, did we have any specific designs or even like family houses that continued down the line of how goldsmithing was done, right? And then final question, sorry, is the gold trading that continues to happen in Lagos now, how is that impacted by the tax system or by the government? Because I don't see that that's really impacting how much gold is being traded. And the question then is, why is there a discontinuation of goldsmithing, and how do you think, but how do you think that can then evolve into creating some sort of economic industry or commercialization moving forward?
Yeah.
Many questions. So
thank you so much. So your first question with regards to formal and informal economy, I tried to sort of say registered goldsmiths, according to administration, like it seems unlikely, as I said, for the 1950s that it was only 4 gold traders, right, that would be in existence. So I don't quite trust the figures that I have. And also sort of reading in newspapers or reading in the archives is that for the time being that your registration or your licensing is pending, you're actually operating in the so-called informal economy, right? Because you're not officially licensed. So I don't think we can divide it that strictly, perhaps. With regards to later periods, I mean, I'm the wrong person to comment on it again, but like I think from what we've heard for the more recent period, like how, and it reminded me a lot of what I've read for the 1940s, it would be the police and the inspector of mines that would come to your goldsmith shop, would inspect your books. They could steal your, you know, how, if your books are not correct, who stops them from taking all your gold in a sense, you know? So I feel like from what we've heard in some of the answers today, that there might perhaps be a certain continuation in the ways in which, you know, these sort of laws or the legislation is enacted, to put it that way. That was one thought I had to your question. And in terms of specific designs, we've seen tools like molds being made, right? So on the one hand side, we have from one goldsmith that told us when, in terms of mold and casting, we had used hundreds and thousands of times, which in a sense speaks to continuation of certain designs. But then we also heard about catalogs. And sort of people then, I was thinking about fashion design in a sense, sort of when new catalogs come out and sort of fashion changes in a way. And also sort of what I said, the job of alterations in a sense. So in a sense, at some point you might want to update your designs, right? So you go to a goldsmith, they melt the gold and make a new design. Yeah. So, but I like the idea of thinking if there's continuations in designs, especially among families or as a we are recognizing.
I think one point about the catalogue that I found fascinating was the goldsmith described that, okay, the catalogs were big and thick, but the picture of the catalogue, in the catalogue, let's say you want this pair of earrings like a rose. There was also the amount of gold that was there. So when you come back and you're given the rose earrings, you can ask them to wait to check that actually it's the same as the carats in the catalog. Do we have any more questions? I'm going to take silence as a no. So I'd like 2 things before I ask you to applaud Katharina, to invite Lawan to come forward. Can we have a round of applause for our host? Anybody here who doesn't know him, this is Lawan Adams, who is the proprietor of Oniko House, which is a mini museum dedicated to the history of Lagos. After we close here formally, he's going to offer a tour. So if you have a few extra minutes, that will take off as soon as we end this formally. I'd like to thank Katharina. I'd like to thank Katharina. I think that it's been, I think as I'm talking, I guess I should be on the screen myself, yeah. So I'd like to thank her. Thank her again. And I'd like to thank yourself, A, for coming and for being such an interested and enthusiastic audience. For myself, I think she's unveiled for me a fascinating period in Lagos history. And I hope her research continues, and we look forward to the book. And anybody who would like to take the tour, Lawan is available. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Aduke. It's been a pleasure. Very interesting learning experience having you here. One of the things I'd just like to, and of course, before we got to this stage, Katharina and I, we met and we discovered we part of history. We had a lot to share. Running this kind of establishment, which was obviously gathering information, history of Lagos, and listening to different perspectives. It was also a really interesting thing to meet with her. But more importantly, a lot of work that I researched that she did was gathering information from newspapers, if I'm correct. And I think that skill, and if you look into the history of Lagos, especially within that period that you specified, that's the 20s, 1920s to the 40s and further down. Quite a number of the people that were quite prominent there were newspaper, yes, from Jackson to Davis to all of them. And I think that we're at a stage whereby something is not done about that, we might lose all this information. That has borne this opportunity to even learn about Goldsmiths, because you can see that a lot of our research was from the newspapers. I don't know where this is going to lead. I know this is just a project for you, but I think we need to look at how this very vital document, how we're going to preserve it, how we're going to digitalize, how we're going to, like I said, this business is storytelling, and you tell these stories from different perspectives. When we started this project, I remember that we went to the universities to tell us the history of Nigeria and Lagos. But there were books written by colonials, and it was from their own perspective. But we had to now start to look for Nigerian historians and people that will connect the story. The project is meant to connect from a certain generation to the younger generation. And we say that because if you look at our young folks now, they're in the music, they're in the arts, they're in the drama, it will help them if they had a good grounded knowledge of their history. And then they can choose the stories they want to tell. And that primarily is why we do this project. And when you say that, this is obviously the source of it, this newspaper, what is material, how they can extract what is needed for them without having to tell all sorts of boring stories. So I think, first and foremost, everybody here obviously is interested in this. And I thought that it would be important to mention this here, the great job she's done, and then how we can take that forward to make sure that these records are kept. I know this might be a bit beyond you, but at least let's start to think about that. Thank you very much.
So, yeah, no, no, in response to thinking about newspapers, there's recently been a very, very, fascinating, no, not fascinating is the wrong word, very impressive project of an individual who's actually started as a group, I think a fairly small group. Please help me tell the story. Right, exactly. Digitizing Nigerian newspapers. So they started with PM News. I think they're doing 1960 to 2010 now. But his ambition really is to digitize all Nigerian newspapers in a sense. So there's one web page now, and it's wonderful.
Everyone who wants to
archiving, yes, archiving, archive.ng is the address.
Thank you very much. Again, thank you to Katharina, thank you to Iboliko House, thank you to everybody here. I think we can formally close, and anybody who would like a tour, Lawan is available. And if you don't want to tour, you just want to talk to Catherine, she's available. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good week.
Okay, so if you like to talk, please follow.
Yeah.
Follow, because they're going to hold it.